Extremely special guest here today. First time we've had a filmmaker, an active filmmaker on a podcast. So very excited to talk to Kurtis Spieler. In addition to having a job at Vinegar Syndrome, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit, he's also getting a lot of attention and acclaim for his role in kind of redirecting New York Ninja. So Kurtis, thank you so much for making some time here today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. I think maybe it's kind of a fun place to start. There's a couple different things I really want to do as like a foundation to this, but I've never seen the term redirector before. And as I started doing some research, I saw that name kind of pop up in a lot of the articles and reviews and interviews and stuff. So I thought that was kind of fun. If you want to give just a little bit of background as to the redirector credit.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I might be the only person to actually have that credit. I'm not 100% on that. I'd have to check, but I'm pretty sure I'm the only one. Well, I guess for the listeners who don't know, New York Ninja was a movie that was originally shot in 1984. And due to like production issues and budgetary problems, the movie was never finished and was subsequently abandoned. Fast forward about 35 years later, and I am working for the wonderful company Vinegar Syndrome. And I find out that we have the unedited camera rolls in our film archive. The only problem is all the sound elements were missing. So basically we had unedited picture for an unfinished movie and with no sound. So after talking to the owners here, they gave me the green light to essentially reassemble the film. And I basically had to write a new script for it. We brought in some genre actors to dub the voices. We brought in an awesome band called Voyager 3 to do a new score. A company named 3 Beep, which we'll get into, I'm sure, did a lot of the sound work on the film. And essentially, we created the best version that we could of the movie. At the end of the day, how do you credit yourself for that? I mean, I wasn't on the original production. I didn't actually shoot any of the footage, but I carried the whole project across the finish line, and I did make a lot of creative choices to get the movie finished. So when trying to figure out how we were going to credit me for this, I guess redirector was I guess the best term that we could come up with, because that's essentially what I did. I took it in a slightly different direction and carried the ball across the finish line, so to speak.
Well, I mean, that's the crazy thing about this project is maybe you took it in a slightly different direction. It's not entirely it's not entirely sure. I mean, there's a good chance you did, but like it feels really authentic to something that would have come out around that time.
Yeah, well, we tried to stay as true to what we suspected the original of the film to be. So, we were trying to be as respectful to the material. And anybody who's seen the movie knows that, like, we didn't really add any humor. Any of the humor that's in the film was essentially inherent to the film itself. We basically played it straight. And so the campiness, the silliness, all that just kind of comes through organically. So, we try to be as respectful, but there were, creative choices that had to be made, not just in the edit, but, throughout the whole process. So, which I'm sure we'll get into more as we go along.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Anytime you have a ninja rollerblading to a fight, I feel like the humor's there. You just need to kind of like play it straight. I feel like that's the right choice.
Yeah, that's something we debated a lot. So for people who have seen it, yeah, like there's a lot of campiness to the film. And, as I was going through the footage and was seeing what was there, initially I thought I was probably going to have to make this thing more interesting because we hadn't seen the footage. When we went into this whole process, we hadn't seen anything yet. We just knew that we had this unfinished movie in our film archive. Mm-hmm. And I assumed it was unfinished, maybe because it wasn't that good or maybe it was boring. And so I didn't know what I was going to have to do to maybe like amp it up and make it more interesting. But man, I'll tell you, once we got into the footage, it's pretty interesting. I mean, every scene is entertaining in its own. So really the best thing to do at that point was to play it straight and let whatever campiness or whatever just come through naturally. And I think that's what we're resonating with when they watch. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I certainly loved it and have seen most of the special features on the disc, which is quite extensive, that goes into the background of the film because I became a little obsessed with it after I saw it. But really quickly, before we dive in, I want to go back just a little bit. So we'll kind of like put a time like pause in there and then go backwards in time just a little bit, and then we can pick it up from here momentarily. So this came around because Vinegar Syndrome made a decision a few years back to acquire some films from a company that's now defunct called 21st Century Distribution. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, and that catalog has like a bunch of blaxploitation movies, and it's got a bunch of, I think there's some movies that y'all have even put out on a VSA, if I'm not wrong. And it has some stuff like Terminal Island, I think, was part of that. I mean, it's got a lot of the titles that are now out on Vinegar Syndrome are kind of coming from that acquisition, right?
Yeah, like Red Mob and like The Executioner Part 2. Those are like two that come to mind. Yeah, we've put out a number of their films.
Okay, and so there, y'all, the films were now in your archive. And by the way, I don't know if you know this, but we spoke to Justin Liberty a few months back. So we were super excited to kind of have a little bit more of the Vinegar Syndrome family here on the podcast. But anyways, so y'all have those rights now. And then, did you know about New York Ninja already, and you were just excited it was in there, or like kind of how did you single that one out and be like, oh no way, this is here, you know?
So it was technically acquired before I started with the company. I've been here for about 4 years now.
Yeah.
And so the story that I heard is that when we acquired this group of films from 21st Century Distribution, one of the owners here, Ralph Stevens, went to basically go pick up all the film so we could bring it here to our film archive. And when they were going through the list of like elements that we were picking up, they saw this title, New York Ninja, and Arthur Schweitzer, who used to work for 21st Century Distribution, he was the one who we purchased this group of films from. He had the rights to them still. I guess Ralph said to Arthur, you know, what's this movie, New York Ninja? Like we didn't really ask for this. And he said, well, it's this movie that we shot in the 80s and we never finished it. You can, you know, keep the footage, get rid of it, do whatever you want. But luckily Vinegar Syndrome didn't get rid of it. And it went in our film archive, and nobody had seen any at this point, seen any of the footage. And so, you know, they were trying to basically figure out what to do with it. And then I started working there, and I found out about it like basically my first day of work. I happen to be in the film archive, and Brandon Upson, who's basically he's like our resident film scanner and one of our restoration artists. He's the one who was like showing me around the film archive, and there's these boxes labeled New York Ninja. And Brandon was telling me that, you know, to his knowledge, it was this unfinished ninja movie. And I was like, oh, well, that's exciting. I would, you know, be interested in maybe editing that back together. Come to find out, all the sound elements were missing. And so that's when I was like, well, that's going to be a big process. So I just kind of let it go after that. And after I was working for the company for about a year or so is when all of a sudden I kind of, you know, once I was feeling more comfortable here and I was working on some of my own projects, I decided, you know, maybe there's something that can be done with this. So I went to the owners and I was like, hey, what if you guys let me kind of take a look at this? If it's worth finishing, maybe we can bring in some, you know, genre actors to dub the voices and stuff. And they loved the idea. And so we went from there.
Wow. And just for because that's the second time the genre actors have come up, and maybe that's a great segue into who they are, because it just puts a huge smile on my face. So I'm just going to rattle off a couple of names really quick. You know, Don the Dragon Wilson, Michael Berryman, Liana Quigley, Leon Isaac Kennedy, Cynthia Rothrock, Ginger Lynn. I feel like I'm missing some big ones, but it's just like, you know, it's just this incredible list of talent of people that were making movies in the 80s and 90s in a big way, and have had a relationship with Vinegar Syndrome through a lot of them through Vinegar Syndrome archive line. I think, to be honest, although I'm sure there's some cross there between the two different lines. Is that relationship with them just very friendly by nature because of all the different kind of interviews and, you know, behind the scenes features and all that stuff? Is it a pretty established relationship at this point?
Yeah, for the most part. So when we when I presented this idea to the owners, like we knew right away that if we were going to cast genre actors to do the voices, we wanted to cast people that had been in other movies that Vinegar Syndrome has released. So
Okay.
that was planned from the very beginning. Who we were going to use was debatable, but that's when we kind of started going through, our own releases to see, hey, who would work for this voice, Linnea Quigley was pretty much like one of the ones that we were definitely going to use, because I think we've put out probably more of her movies than maybe anybody else.
Right.
But you would mention our VSA line, Vinegar Syndrome Archive. We started doing more action stuff through that line. It's just kind of something that naturally happened. And that's when we ended up acquiring films from like Cynthia Rothrock and Don the Dragon Wilson. Vince Murdocco was another one. So they sort of kind of ended up in that line just because that's kind of naturally become our action line. It's not necessarily all the action. It's a little hard to explain, but for the short answer, that's a lot of our action movies end up on VSA. And so, we started casting, but it was all just planned to be around Vinegar Syndrome people. And so, we had connections to some of them. So it was easy to kind of contact them. But like Cynthia Rothrock and Don the Dragon were like kind of new to the group. So we didn't have necessarily an established relationship with them at the time, but it's grown over the releases and obviously over New York Ninja. So
that's great. Yeah, I don't mean to go too far down the VSA line, but I was joking with somebody I was on the line with the other day, talking about how I think y'all have released all of Jalal Mary's films at this point, or nearly all of them at this point, which is great. I all the ones I've seen so far.
He's actually really great to work with. I mean, for anybody who doesn't know, he did a lot of low budget action movies in the 90s, and man, are they fun. I really enjoy. I'm glad we're putting them out because I enjoy them too.
They're super fun. He seems like, anyways, like the commentaries and stuff, he seems like a pretty down to earth, normal guy, which is cool. So then the other piece of this is, I guess, obviously you. So you joined Vinegar Syndrome 4 years ago and are primarily involved in sort of like an editing role. Like, right? Is that right? Is that kind of a big role part of what you do for them?
Yeah, so when I first started, I started as a restoration artist and editing special features. As time has gone on, our schedule has gotten increasingly more full. And so keeping up with the special features, we actually outsource a lot of them to different editors now. So I don't do as many special features as I used to, but that's basically, at least the first year here, I was basically doing all editing for special features and restoration. Now I've moved on and still doing restoration, but doing a lot of other things such as New York Ninja. So
when you were actually in the thick of it, like what percentage of your year was spent making this? Like, was it like 50%, 80%? Like how much of your time was focused on this?
Well, it's actually kind of interesting because we're such a busy company and we're sort of like a very DIY company. So everybody here kind of wears a lot of hats. I actually couldn't work on New York Ninja during my work hours.
Okay.
Yeah. So that was kind of like one of the deals from the very beginning. This is why, one of the reasons why nobody was able to do anything with it is because we were just so busy and somebody had to basically take it under their wings and be willing to put in the work from the beginning. So actually I was working on it a lot on the weekends and at night, which is also one of the reasons why it took a lot of time to put the whole thing together. But I was probably, at least for the first 6 months, working probably 7 days a week, Monday through Friday. I was doing, stuff for Vinegar Syndrome, and then Saturday and Sunday I was in the building working on New York Ninja. So yeah.
I feel like that's a great segue. So, okay, now let's get into the movie a little bit. You did an amazing job with this. Like,
thank you.
Like, I'm sure you've heard it a lot now. I just I was thinking it was going to be a What's Up Tiger Lily kind of experience when I heard what was going on. And that would have been fine. Like, that would have been okay. Like, that's What's Up Tiger Lily has its own sort of charm, right? But it's not that. Like, y'all, you, I guess, primarily, as well as I'm sure all the other folks that were involved, like you made an 80s action movie that's like dubbed, right? And everything about it just feels like like you restored it and then put it out. It doesn't feel like it was made in 2021. I was so impressed by that. Like that's so hard to do, to kind of be like empathetic enough to put yourself in the mindset of this genre film basically that you're trying to recreate from raw, like, not audio files. What is it? Footage, or just raw footage, right? Without any sound. Um, can you just walk it all through that process of like sitting down with the footage, going through it from the mindset of sort of, I guess storyboarding it, or kind of however that first process goes, and then thinking about the dialogue, and like just any insight there would be amazing because the execution is really good.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you. I appreciate that. And actually, it's I'll start off by saying it's really nice because a lot of people have complimented me and everybody who worked on the movie in terms of it feels like authentic to the time period, which is exactly what we were going for. I mean, as much as I love sort of getting a lot of credit for what I did, honestly, the best compliment is if people didn't know that we did anything to it. If people just assumed that we found it and just re-released it, like that would be, that's great because that means we did our job. So that's basically what we set out to do from the very beginning. Yeah, in order to kind of explain how that came to be, I mean, it was definitely a process. So, the short version is this: we scanned in all the footage, and then I got basically digital files of all of the footage. And so my first step was to basically just go through everything and see what we actually had, because some of it was determining like what was actually finished with this movie. Were all the scenes shot? We had heard from Arthur early on that he believed that the ending was never finished, and so we needed to see kind of what was there. So really the first part of my job was just going through the footage, cataloging everything and seeing what was there. And really the only way to do that was going by the slate at the beginning of each shot. So I would go through, I would say, oh, I'd see the slate, it would say, okay, scene 43. And I would get all the stuff that I could see that was from scene 43, and I would put it aside and, have my own little bin for each scene. And then I would go through and start editing each scene just to get a feel for what was there and if I could make a completed scene out of it. So I kind of worked just in scenes. In the meantime, while I was doing that, I was kind of getting a feel for the movie and at least getting an idea for either what I thought the scene was about or what I thought I could make the scene about. But again, we were trying to stay as true to the quote unquote original version as possible. So when I laid everything out in a timeline in the order that the scenes were listed, it made no sense, and it makes even less sense than it does now. So I knew right away that in order to make this movie work, we were going to have to take some liberties with the footage that was there and kind of move scenes around and all that kind of thing. So again, as I was going through, I was taking notes, and I would kind of get an idea of like, maybe the order that the scenes would play. And then like, if I needed to move things around, what that scene could be, where could it go? And especially when it came to the dialogue scenes, the easiest thing for me was to just edit it as smoothly as possible. Yeah. So I didn't necessarily worry about like, hey, is this line supposed to come before this line? Because really, I didn't even know what they were saying. So I just wanted to edit the scene as smoothly as possible. So that's kind of really what I focused on first, more than anything. And then I, once that was done, I, like I said, I was moving things around and trying to basically get a story structure that I thought could work. And then after I had what I thought was like a nice solid edit, that's when I went in and started, writing dialogue and kind of trying to match what was there. Some of the performances are really big and you can read the lips sometimes. So if I could read the lips, I try to keep what was there. And then anything else, I would try to, kind of match syllables the best I could and match the timing. But some of it was really just, again, trying to basically like bridge the scenes, make sense out of what was happening in that scene, and then, make sense for the other scenes coming down the road, So yeah, that was basically the process. So, that was not something that I had really done before. But because I was really the only one going through the footage, I had the best feel for it. And then I was, kind of determining, okay, this scene doesn't really work. Maybe we lose this one. This scene does work. Let's move it over here. This doesn't make sense. Let's, move things around till it does make sense. And then, the ending, was technically unfinished, and we can kind of go into that. That's almost its own story in and of itself. But yeah, anybody who's seen it, the helicopter scene is what I'm talking about, and that's a whole conversation into itself. But anyway, that's basically the process that I went through in terms of like editing it and then writing the new dialogue.
Wow. I definitely want to hear about the ending, but one of the things that jumped out to me, what you just said, was like, I think about all the stories about, like Hitchcock's editor, or all the stories about these like auteurs that had this editor that was like right there with them through most of their career, and how the editor is not as well known as the director. And I'm not trying to get into like a big debate here, but the thing that really strikes me about what you just said is it's like this story is like the editors are having their day, right? Like this shows the creativity and the storytelling that happens from the editor's chair, right? Whereas I don't think that story is told as often.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're definitely right. That's why it's like really hard to kind of, in trying to determine what credit I should have. It's really difficult because like basically more than anything, I'm the editor, but I made a lot of creative choices just to be able to tell the story. But then, the other creative choices were things in like the casting and the directing of the voice actors and the music and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, you're right. It really shows like how much editing really molds a film. I mean, I could only work with what was on, basically what was given to me. I had no control over what was done on set. So but I had to take that and kind of turn it into a movie. And yeah, I mean, I think that just kind of shows the power of editing. So any directors out there, either learn how to edit yourself or find a good editor and become tight with them, because it's hugely important.
I think a lot of famous sort of directors know that. And I think I'm not saying that to your comment. I think just when I read, like, I did a deep dive into Fellini's films last year, and like, as he spoke about the editor, it was always with a lot of love. And like, I think a lot of the ones that are sort of the names that we know, they all were able to find that. And so I think there's something to that. But anyways, okay. So then at this point, you have a story, you have dialogue, and you have some actors cast. We all know the importance of Foley art, sound design, and music in a film as well. And so that's when you mentioned earlier, I believe it's 3 Beep or Beep 3, right?
3 Beep.
Yep. 3 Beep, as well as Voyager 3. I'm curious if it's just like a quick background of kind of how you found them. Did you know them already? Had you worked with them before, or like how was that process?
So yeah, 3 Beep, their background is basically they would dub foreign films into English or for the American market, and they also did animation. Again, one of the owners here, Ralph Stevens, he knew the owner, Charles Darby. Okay. I don't know if he knew him from back in the day, or I'm not quite sure their relationship, but he was familiar with 3 Beep, and so he's the one who got the ball rolling with them. I then worked with the I guess you would say like they're the voiceover directors. I worked with them because, again, this isn't something that I had done. I've made a few of my own low budget independent films, but I've never really had to tackle this level of like ADR, basically, is I guess what I would call it. So like, being able to hit that timing and, working with the actors for that kind of stuff was, something that I needed a little bit of help with. And I actually give a lot of credit to 3 Beat. Plus, they also were instrumental in the sound design. So like every footstep, every, broken window or sound effect, punch, kick, whatever, that was all from 3 Beep. And, when working with the guys who did the sound design, we talked early on, like, how are we going to handle this? How is it going to sound? And really, it was the same thing. It's like, basically play it straight and try to make it sound like it came out of the 80s.
Yeah.
And that was really great because they got that. A lot of the guys, they're familiar with this type of work, or they've been in the industry long enough that they know how things should sound for that time period.
Yeah.
And they were hugely a huge help in all of that. So I give a lot of credit to 3B, because without them, the sound design wouldn't be what it is.
Crazy. And then yeah, I'm so glad we kind of are talking about them then, because it's a huge part of the movie. And then the soundtrack is great for this movie. Like I mean, the original lyrics, like obviously a lot of original songs, like it's great. Is this some people that you knew? Did you have tryouts, or like how did that go for that?
Yeah, so Voyager 3 is the one who did the score, and so there's a lot of bands out there nowadays that are doing this sort of like synth rock kind of almost like creating soundtracks for movies that don't exist. They have this like very 80s kind of sound, and there's a lot of these bands doing that. And early on, I just started kind of going through and listening to a bunch of bands like that, trying to find out if somebody had the right sound. And then actually, again, Brandon Upson, who works here at Vinegar Syndrome, he had recommended Voyager 3, and I had heard of them. I had heard a little bit by them, but I wasn't really super familiar with them. So that night I ended up going home and downloading a bunch of their music and listening to it. And instantly I was like, oh, I think these guys are the guys. So they had Brandon had contact with them. So he passed me their contact info. I reached out to Steve Green, who is basically the one who kind of, he's part of Voyager 3, but he kind of like manages them and, handles all their I don't know, a lot of the writing and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, I talked to him, and he was like immediately on board, because like I said, there's a lot of bands doing this kind of thing where they're like creating these like 80s soundtracks, but they actually got to create a soundtrack for an 80s movie for real, not just something that's like supposed to sound like an 80s soundtrack. Like they basically were able to go back in time and create a soundtrack for an 80s movie, which is, same thing for me. I was basically able to go back in time and make an 80s movie, which is something we could talk about later. But they were on board right away, and they got it. Voyager 3 just got it right from the start. And so, we were doing all this remotely. They're in like the Detroit area. So I sent them a silent version of the movie that I had edited with my new script, so they could kind of tell what was going on. Yeah. And they did a score completely off of that. And I actually remember the first time he sent like the score back to me to like listen to for the first time, and I was very nervous because I knew the music was going to kind of like make or break the movie. And right away I was like, oh man, this is like perfect. I was like so excited. So it was really cool. Very little changed from that first version. We might have moved some things around and changed a few things here or there, but like they nailed it right out of the gates. And I give them a huge amount of credit for what they did, because they worked very hard, and it came out great.
I mean, even if you think about like Action USA, which is one of my favorite movies of all time, or Champagne and Bullets, which I'll also put out, these are like projects by insane people in a way. I'm sure, I mean, with all respect, like these projects are crazy and beautiful, and they're, this music wasn't like that, in that it was more professional than those, but it wasn't far away from that. Like it had the same spirit, which I think is great. Like that's one of the hardest things to capture, is how do you recreate something, make it a good piece of music, but also not make it sound like extremely polished, because that's not what that era was about.
Right. And and they did a lot of music. If you watch a lot of 80s movies, depending upon the budget, there's not that much music in them. Sometimes there would be like a theme that would repeat throughout. Totally, yeah. But we had a lot of room we had to fill, because even though we had a whole sound design done, this was still a silent movie. So we had to fill a lot of space,
Yeah.
and a lot of, the score really helps with that. It helps, transition scenes, helps make scenes make a little bit more sense, all that kind of thing. So anyway, yeah, they did an immense amount of work, and I give them a ton of credit, because it's one of the things that people walk away from more than anything is going, wow, the music in that is awesome. So they nailed it. So kudos to
Okay.
them.
And yeah, no, totally kudos to them. That's they're and it's everything just kind of came together in such a fun way. But you touched on something that I wanted to ask about. You kind of casually said, I sent it to them remotely. They were in Detroit, but this was all done. Everything you just said was done during COVID, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So there was no physical connection, really, throughout the whole process, right?
Correct. Yeah. Actually, so even with the voice actors, basically the way it worked, it was all done through remote sessions, which was both a blessing and, obviously it was a curse in the sense that the pandemic hit, and it was terrible because we early on we were working on this before the pandemic hit. So it's like, okay, how are we going to handle this? And so the idea was to do the majority of our casting in New York and LA, and then I would go out to both those places. Like we would find studios out in both of those
Okay.
places, and we would go out, and we could do all the voice recording in like a few days, um and but then the pandemic hit, and that all got shut down. And so for a while there, we were trying to figure out, how are we going to handle this? But as things started progressing, a lot of these companies, a lot of these sound studios, they got really good at doing remote sessions, and it
Right.
actually opened up more possibilities to us, because now once the studios started opening back up, what we could do is we weren't so much limited to like New York and LA now, different places, and all we had to do was find the closest studio to them. So I think Michael Berryman was in Florida, Vince Murdocco was in Canada, Ginger Lynn was in Nevada, and like Matt Mittler was in New York, and Don, Cynthia Leon, they were all in different parts of LA. So basically the way it worked was they would go to whatever studio was closest to them, and we would remote link to 3 Beep in New York, and I would be here in the Vinegar Syndrome building, and we were all connected. We could all see the video, and we could all hear each other. And sometimes I could see the actors in the booth, and we did it all that way, which is one of the few things we actually could do during the pandemic. So
Right.
it definitely slowed things down for us, but in some ways, it actually helped out. So difficult process, but it all worked out at the end of the day.
That's amazing. I not to there's very few things I could say about Disney that would be relevant to what you just said. But I have a little 4-year-old, and we just saw that movie Encanto, and he's like obsessed with it. So he wants to see all the like behind the scenes and all that stuff. And the thing that was crazy about that was it was done the same way. Like the whole thing was shot in remote, and people were in Colombia, or they were in Mexico, or they were in New York, or whatever. And like there were some scenes where there was like vocal harmonies, and they had to figure out how to like get them all together. And like the pandemic just brought out some super interesting I guess techniques, just kind of out of necessity, that might still be used like post pandemic, right? Because if you don't have to fly to LA and get everybody in there one day for a shoot, like why have that cost, I guess, right?
Yeah, well, exactly. And like, actually, my fiance, she works at a music studio here in Connecticut, and that's one of the things that during the pandemic, all of a sudden they were mostly focused on music, but now they do a ton of voiceover, and they're working with Netflix and Disney and all these places, and because they need studios that are closest to the actors, and
Right.
some of the actors have moved out of the city areas. Because of the pandemic or whatever. And, it's actually become a pretty big business doing all like the ADR and voiceover remotely, and people have gotten really good at it. So
Good.
I guess it is kind of the one thing, one of the good things production wise that came out of this whole thing. So
Crazy. Um, all right. So we get to the point now where I think it'd be super interesting to talk about the ending, because I was just trying to go through my head. We covered a lot of the big questions I had around like the background to this, because I think it's so fascinating. And by the way, just so you don't have to do it, if anybody is still with us, I meant to say this earlier. Are there any copies left on Vinegar Syndrome? Like, is it possible to still buy it there, or is it all sold out?
No, it's still possible.
Okay, go buy it. Like it, I think like not only just I like promoting Vinegar Syndrome. I'm a subscriber. Like I like the company a lot. I think it's super interesting what y'all are doing for boutique distribution. But even beyond that, like the stories, the way that the passion that comes through of the supplemental material and like the behind the scenes featurette is very quite unique, I think, for any movie, let alone like a genre movie. And a lot of really cool like on set or on what's it called, on location kind of like short shorts and documentaries there that show like where it was shot and all that kind of stuff. So I just think it's like from top to bottom, it's a great release. Plus, it's a cool. It looks nice on a shelf. But
Yeah, well, the box, like the special edition version, that there's a limited number of those, and those are selling out. Once the limited edition is gone, there'll probably be like a standard edition, but it won't have like the we did literally like a box. It comes in this box with this great artwork,
yeah,
and there's a booklet in there that I wrote that covers a lot of like the process and kind of is more from like my personal perspective working on the project. You won't be able to get that for very long, so when that's sold out, that'll be gone. So get your copy while you can, because I think like you said, the presentation of it is really cool, and people dig it. So get that while you can.
very much so. So I'm debating in my head whether we talk about the ending now or the big question I kind of had about what's next. Let's talk about the ending, and then what I want to, because you said there's a cool story there about how you finished it. So I definitely want to hear about that. But then I also want to hear like outside of Sheepskin and The Devil's Well, and I think you have another movie coming out that's called Apartment 3.
The Dead Girl in Apartment 3. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm curious to hear a little bit about, are you going to make like your own movies, or has this ignited a passion for you in re-editing and redirecting? And sort of, are you looking for other projects in that area? But maybe before we get into that, if you could quickly, or in a long form, however you want to do it, tell the story about how you completed the movie, because I think that's a really cool story as well.
Yeah. Well, yeah, let's talk about the ending, definitely. So for anybody who's seen the movie, I'm not going to spoil the ending, but well, I kind of have to spoil it a little bit. All right. So slight spoiler warning. There's an explosion at the end of the movie. I'll just say that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And it kind of comes out of nowhere. it's a little surprising. It has to do with the helicopter, and that's basically what I'll say. Now, when I was editing, again, we were told that the ending, to their knowledge, wasn't finished. And so when I started going through the footage, I started seeing all the stuff with the helicopter, and it's pretty crazy. Like the footage that they did shoot was pretty crazy, like hanging from a helicopter and all that kind of thing. Okay. I didn't have very much footage to work with, and you could tell that they hadn't finished editing it, or shooting it. If they had, I don't know what their plan for it was. Maybe they had something in their mind but it felt to me more like they were trying to kind of feel it out. And they were shooting near the end of December at this point. I could tell from the slate they were shooting like October, November, December. And I'm sure it was getting cold, and I'm sure they weren't quite sure what to do with all of this. So I don't know if they took a break, and then this was at the end of 84. So in 85 is when 21st Century Distribution went bankrupt. So I'm not quite sure when that all happened, but I think maybe they had intended to do more, never did. Anyway, all I can say is there wasn't a lot of footage there. So for me, I had to figure out, how am I going to end this thing? And I used like every piece of film that I basically could with that helicopter to try to make something work. But I needed to have an explosion to kind of cap it all off. And I had, early on, I had decided that I wasn't going to shoot any new footage. Okay. We had talked about this, like, what if there's major portions of the movie missing? Like, how are we going to handle that? But one of the things was maybe, actually shoot some stuff if we felt that it was necessary. But as I got in there and started going through the footage, I realized that we had enough to make the movie. So I really wanted to work with what was there. which in and of itself was a challenge, really. I mean, there was times where if like we could go out and shoot some cutaways, it would have made my life a lot easier. But again, we wanted to maintain the integrity of the original version as much as possible. So I made it my mission to use what was there. So aside from the actual credits, which were added, I didn't want to use any new footage aside from this explosion. And so when I had made the decision basically to end it with an explosion, well, the way that they came about was like I had said before that we had released other 21st century distribution films, and one of them that I mentioned was The Executioner Part 2. Yeah. And when I wasn't quite sure how I was going to end the movie, I had The Executioner Part 2 on just like in the background one day when I was doing some work, and I noticed there's a stock explosion in the movie. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder if I could do something with that. And again, without giving away too much of the ending, you know, I sort of started molding it around that idea of like having this explosion. And the best part about it was it's the only piece of new footage that we added. However, it's from a 21st century distribution film. Okay. So, you know, I kind of put myself in the mind frame of an editor in the 80s. Like that's how I went through this whole process was I just imagined like working for whatever company, 21st century, whoever. And they brought me a movie and they were like, hey, listen, we need to finish this. It's kind of a mess. It's your job to fix it. Like, what would an editor do back then? Especially if the ending wasn't really there, right? Most likely they would have gone, well, we have this stock explosion over here. Maybe I can use that for something. And so that's how this all came about, which is great because we have the film elements here for Executioner Part 2. So we were able to rescan them, and then I overlaid the explosion, and that's how I made it work. So it's the only piece of like new footage technically, but it's in the spirit of what would have been done then. And I think it was a creative fix, to say the least.
I love that. That reminds me of, did you ever see Arrow's release of Roger Corman's Bloodbath?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
And that's such a great example of what you're talking about, where they basically like, he financed this film to be made in Hungary and I guess didn't like it. And so brought it back and had like 2 additional edits of like, there were different movies from that raw footage. And he wound up shooting like maybe 5 minutes of footage on this one and maybe 10 minutes of footage on that one, and pieced together like 3 movies based off of like some core footage. So it feels like that kind of low budget filmmaking, you just did what you could, right? Like you just got it finished. And
yeah. I mean, a lot of people have kind of compared this to Godfrey Ho's films. If anybody's familiar with Godfrey Ho, like that's basically what he did. He shot a few like ninja movies, and he would use the same footage over and over again and create new movies. He would buy like unfinished movies from like Taiwan or the Philippines or whatever, and then he would cut in this ninja footage and make entirely new plots and redub them and all this kind of stuff. So a lot of people have compared this to that, and to some people that might not be a compliment, but to me it definitely is. So I'll take it.
Yeah. Y'all need to put out a Godfrey Ho box set, by the way, while I have you on the line.
Well, that would be awesome. Honestly, the hardest part is his filmography. If anybody's ever tried to do a deep dive into Godfrey Ho's filmography, it's not easy. And I'm pretty sure I read an interview with him one time where he said, I'm not even sure how many movies I've made. So because if you check his filmography, it's like he'll have like 10 movies that came out in like 85, you know, and they're all ninja movies, but it's all just because they were recut. So
funny. That's an ambitious project. Wow, that's amazing. Well, yeah. Anyways, I've already said it a couple of times, but the movie, it's just from beginning to end, is very fun, very entertaining. I'm really glad you put the time and effort in to make it. So that leads to my next question: is kind of what's next. I know you mentioned you do have that movie coming out. Do you have the bug for making redirecting a thing? Like, did you get the bug?
So before New York Ninja, it's basically how I ended up at the company was, you know, so we're here in Connecticut. That's where Vinegar Syndrome is. And I'm a filmmaker in Connecticut. And I knew some of the guys who worked for Vinegar Syndrome. And that's basically how I got my foot in the door. But I was basically hired hoping that one day we would kind of move into original productions here. And that's one of the reasons why they brought me in. And New York Ninja sort of kicked that off. And now we have what's called Vinegar Syndrome Pictures, which is acquiring movies off of the film festival circuit as long as they've been shot on film, and then moving into original productions. But after kind of the success of New York Ninja, I'm hoping that we can find some of these other lost films that are out there that need some level of production in order to finish them. So I'm keeping my options open right now, but it's basically how, the reason I got involved with the company is hoping to do more stuff like this. So whether it be an actual, from the ground up, original production, or whether or not it'll be like finishing another one of these movies, that still kind of remains to be seen. But I actually really fell in love with the process of New York Ninja. I don't know if we'll ever find a movie quite like New York Ninja. Like, trust me when I say, for anybody who hasn't seen it, it is unique. That's the best way to describe it. So, but this idea of like finishing these lost films, these movies that would go unfinished unless somebody, took interest in them and put in a level of production official, it's really interesting to me, and it's really exciting. And what it allowed me to do was use all the skills that I've kind of learned over the years of like my filmmaking career. Cause, basically I've been doing just like low budget horror films, and I learned a lot through that process. A lot of it was, because they were low budget. Like, I went in wanting to be a director, but a lot of times I would write them because I could write within the budget that I knew would work. And then I would produce them, then I would direct them, and then I would edit them. Right. And like the editing and the writing were skills that I was like learning as I was moving forward that I didn't really realize I was learning. Okay. And those skills came in way more handy on New York Ninja than anything else. So I learned a lot about myself and like, my abilities, and, all those years I spent trying to fix my own movies when there were problems, came in handy when trying to fix somebody else's movies. So, I hope there'll be more. There's a little kicker at the end of New York Ninja, a little surprise for anybody who's hasn't seen it. I won't ruin it, but alluding to maybe there'll be more down the road. And if that ever happens, that'd be like the ultimate goal. But that's not necessarily on the horizon right now. But if people enjoy the movie and they support it, maybe that will be down the road. So,
without getting into specifics, because obviously that's confidential, has it been a success in your eyes in terms of like, I guess commercially, kind of what you wanted it to be?
Yeah, I mean, so at recording this where we are right now, New York Ninja is just doing its theatrical run. Mm-hmm. So, the movie's only been out for a few months on Blu-ray, and it's selling very quickly. Our special editions are almost gone already, and then there'll probably be a standard edition after that. And now it's doing its theatrical run, and it's getting to a wider audience. And so it's starting to spread, and which is great. So thus far, yes, I would consider it successful. How much farther that goes, I'm excited to find out.
It's the kind of movie with the background to it and the way it's put together and what's on screen and the costumes of the bad guys are so outlandish. It's the kind of movie that plays well as a midnight movie. Like I think it'll get that following of like the kind of thing you play in festivals and just different, like an event type movie, right, for years to come, because it just has a vibe to it.
Yeah, I mean, I call it like a beer and pizza movie. So like it's definitely one that you want to watch with a group of people. I'm definitely one of those people that likes to watch movies alone because I don't like to be interrupted. But this is one of those movies that you have to watch with friends, or with an audience. Honestly, like seeing it in a theater full of people is the best way to see it, because you will laugh, you will cheer, like you will probably find yourself more involved in the movie when there's an audience around, because I don't want to oversell it, but like, trust me when I say it is a good time. And it's unlike anything you've probably ever seen before.
I believe that. I need to see it live. I'm sure it's playing in Austin. I'm sure y'all are going to come to Austin if you're not already here, right?
Yeah, I think it's scheduled for Austin at some point. So for anybody who likes genre films, if you like movies like, Samurai Cop or Miami Connection, something like that, where you can just have a good time, enjoy it, this is like right up your alley. And again, seeing it with the crowd really is the best way to see it. We're doing actually a 35 millimeter run, so you could see it on like a DCP, a digital version, or you can see the 35, because we actually struck a 35 print.
That's awesome. That's great.
Because it's the way the movie would have been seen in the 80s, and we wanted to give people a chance to see it that way now. And there's a big group of people that enjoy seeing these movies on 35, so if you can see it on 35, that's my recommended way of seeing it.
That's awesome. There's just a quick shout out before we move on too much from Vinegar Syndrome Pictures. Scary of 61st. That movie is awesome. Like, it's really crazy. I never thought I would see another movie that was like Zulawski's Possession. But this woman, I don't remember her name. Dara.
Yeah, sorry.
Anyways, I knew but she did it. Like, that movie, it has that same intensity, and like, it's a psychological kind of movie, and it's great. Like, I don't know what I was expecting, but it wasn't that, and I loved it.
Yeah, well, that's like what Vinegar Syndrome Pictures is made for right now. Because her movie, it did well at festivals, but she shot on 16, and I don't know what kind of distribution it might have gotten if a company like ours wasn't around. But when we saw the opportunity to release it, we jumped at it, because to see a genre movie now shot on 16, that's like sort of this psychological kind of thriller, has some, I would say, controversial moments in it.
Sure.
That's right up Vinegar Syndrome's alley. I mean, we're made for that kind of stuff. So
awesome. Well, I hope you find more of those. And I mean, I'm sure you've thought about this, but I feel like somewhere in Something Weird vaults, there's another New York Ninja laying around. I feel like there has to be, if not that exact thing. I feel like of all the stuff that Mike and Lisa bought over the years, it feels like it should be around there somewhere, if there's going to be another project like this.
Yeah, I hope so. I'd love to do a horror movie next. I mean, I'm a big horror fan. So if we could find an unfinished horror film, that would be really fun to work on.
Cool. Well, the last question I have then, and maybe I should have asked this earlier, but just for anybody who's thinking like, man, like, how does Kurtis get this job? Is it possible you could kind of walk through, like, who was Kurtis at like 14, 15 years old, or whatever that age was when you kind of started getting into movies? 6, I don't know, whatever. And how did you kind of transition that into the, career, making these low budget movies, getting a job at Vinegar Syndrome? Just like, how did that, at the level of detail you're comfortable talking about that, how did that kind of happen for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's been quite the process. Like most people, I think any of us that are big into movies, we started at a young age, like genre movies at a young age. I grew up in the 80s, so I was, my movie education was the mom and pop video shop down the street, So I grew up on a steady diet of horror and action movies. That's pretty much what I lived on. Movies was always something I was interested in. If you look at my 8th grade yearbook, it says in there that like we had to write like what our job would be when we got older, and I said movie producer. So hey. I've kind of followed that path the whole way through. I will say, for anybody who's listening, I definitely doubted myself a lot. When I was in high school and going to college, we had to kind of decide what we wanted to do for the rest of our lives at such a young age. It's kind of hard to figure that out. And, I didn't think that somebody like me makes movies. I didn't think that could be my career. I just saw it as like, well, this is my hobby, I guess, And so I didn't initially go to film school. I ended up going to college actually for like forensics and criminal justice. So, but once I graduated, it just didn't feel right, and it took me a little while, but I ended up going back to school for film. I couldn't afford to go for like a 4-year film program, but I found out that NYU offered film courses, like accelerated film courses for like basically like certificate programs. And I basically like left my life. I was living in DC at the time. I left my life and I moved to New York and took these film classes and actually learned how to shoot film, which is not something that everybody does these days. And that's actually how I got into film. And then, after that, I started making my own like low budget stuff, short films, putting them in film festivals, that whole process. And, it was good. It's just, breaking into features is difficult. So, I started making my own low budget stuff, and it was getting distribution, and that was cool. It just wasn't getting me like recognition to move on to the next step. And I wasn't quite sure where I was going to go after that, but luckily I ended up getting this job at Vinegar Syndrome. Like, all of that helped me get this job. And this is not a job that I ever expected would be in my future, and here I am actually doing the stuff that I wanted to do, which is great. I'm surrounded by film. I'm surrounded by genre films, working on some really cool projects. And then New York Ninja comes along, and now here I am, and I'm doing all the stuff with this film that, I set out to do in the first place, and it's a little different because it's not entirely my film. There's the whole production crew from the 80s plus, the people nowadays. And, it's definitely a group effort putting anything together. But, here I am, and this is already starting to open doors into more projects. So I guess if I was going to give any advice, I would just say, like, one, don't doubt yourself, stick through it, and just be open, because what I've noticed is a lot of people in this industry, you start off thinking you're going to do one thing, and then you end up doing something else, and I never really saw myself as an editor, but, here I am probably getting more recognition for editing than, anything else. So, just keep an open mind and stick to it. And you never know where this crazy life will take you.
Awesome. Well, what a great place to end it. Look, I mean, you came on without really knowing much about who we were, and you've been extremely accommodating and honest and open. And I really appreciate your time. I think this is going to be one that people really enjoy listening to. Anything that I didn't ask, you want me to ask? Future projects or future about Vinegar Syndrome? Anything you feel you want to talk about?
No, just support the company. We're, like I said, we're definitely a DIY company. Buy direct from us. That's how we stay afloat. We offer special editions on our website that we don't on like Amazon and all that other kind of stuff. So vinegarsyndrome.com, support the company, support New York Ninja. If you want to see more projects like this, I would love to be a part of working on them. So yeah, definitely share it with your friends. Let people know. That's all we can really ask these days.
Awesome. Well, Kurtis, thank you so much for your time. And yeah, we'll stay in touch. I can't wait to see what's next.
All right. Yeah. Hopefully we'll be doing this for something else down the road. So thank you.
Yeah, of course.
All right. I appreciate it.